Rome had just defeated Carthage, its greatest foe. Or it believed it was finally safe from external threats. But this victory created a new internal enemy, a vast slave system in Sicily, pushed by dreadful conditions to the breaking point. This wasn't just a riot. This was a war led by a magician prophet named Eunice, who would forge a kingdom from his chains. How did one slave unite 60,000 men and bring the all-powerful republic to its knees? The answer began not with a sword, but with a policy. This new threat was gestating within Rome's own borders, a consequence of its own success. To understand the explosion, one must first understand the pressure. When Rome had conquered the Italian peninsula, its treatment of the local Italics, the Socii, had been strategic and, in its own way, generous. They enjoyed great autonomy. They were not obligated to pay tribute to the Republic. Though they supplied troops to Rome, they were treated as preferred allies, bound by treaty and mutual respect. This system fostered a degree of loyalty, or at least stability. Things were very different in Sicily. Sicily was not an ally, it was a prize. The island had become Rome's first province, a region of immense wealth thanks to its fertile lands and its ideal location for trade. Rome, victorious after the First Punic War, imposed a new system of provincial government. This meant a Roman governor, a heavy military presence, and a substantial collection of taxes. The previous owner of the island had been Carthage. In the aftermath of the war, Rome began to confiscate the lands of all those who had sympathized with the Carthaginian cause. This created a perfect storm of opportunity for Rome's wealthiest citizens. Many Roman investors, primarily from the powerful Equites class, were attracted by the prospect of buying these fertile, cheap lands. They did not buy small farms. They acquired immediate vast tracts of land, establishing the massive agricultural estates known as latifundia. These estates were not family farms. They were industrial-scale operations dedicated to producing grain and other goods for profit. This in turn caused a massive boom in slavery. A great number of slaves from all over the Mediterranean were brought to Sicily to work these new operations. The island became a tinderbox, saturated with a displaced, desperate, and brutalized population. The conditions were beyond dreadful. Many landowners, insulated by distance and power, did not bother to adequately feed or clothe their slaves. Humanity was a luxury they would not afford. Shocker, the slaves were worked until they collapsed, treated as disposable tools, not as people. In many cases, these desperate men and women were forced to resort to banditry, to sack or steal, just to survive. This created an unintended side effect. The slaves, in their struggle for survival, were gaining illicit experience in combat, organization, and logistics. Oh, they were learning to fight. The situation, it seems, worried some senators in Rome.
In Sicily. The slaves are learning to fight. This is desperation.
They saw the instability, the rising tide of desperation. But their hands were tied. Turiniturnum. The lands of Sicily were in the hands of those powerful equites, who also held judicial powers. Whenever charges were presented against the landowners for their cruelty or negligence, nothing was ever done. The system protected itself. With the Senate powerless to act and the landowners shielded by their own power, it was only a matter of time before a group of slaves finally rebelled against their masters. That time came in 135 BC. Spark was lit in the city of Enna. The slaves in this city were known to be especially mistreated. Their lives were a daily register of pain and humiliation. When they conspired to finally rebel, they did not turn to a warrior or a general. They turned to a slave named Eunice as their leader. Eunice was a very special slave. He was not known for his strength, but for his charisma. He had the fame of a magician, and it was said he was capable of performing prophecies. Sunirum, he was a figure of mysticism, a sliver of the divine in a world of pure, brutal materialism. He gave the slaves something more potent than weapons: hope. According to Eunice, one of his divine revelations was that the slave revolt would succeed in capturing the city of Enna. He promised them victory, sanctified by the gods. The revolt began, therefore, when 400 of these slaves, inspired by these prophecies, rose up in arms. As they stormed the city, they gathered other slaves from all corners of Enna to their cause. The revolt was brutal and swift. The rebels quickly killed all the wealthy males in the city. And they made one critical exception. They spared all those who knew how to forge weapons. The roles of society were violently inverted. These smiths were then chained by the slaves themselves and forced to work, manufacturing weapons for the rebel cause. With Enna secured, the prophecy fulfilled, Eunice's authority was absolute. He immediately proclaimed himself king. He took the name Antiochus in honor of the famous Seleucid king, a name that carried weight and legitimacy. He did not take long to assemble a force of 6,000 decently armed slaves. These were not just farmhands. Sirasuri, they were the same men who had been forced into a life of banditry by their master's neglect. Most of them already had combat experience. With this small but impressive army, Eunice, now King Antiochus, began to scourge the surrounding countryside. He recruited more men for the slaves' cause, his army swelling to 10,000. The Romans, for their part, attempted to quell the revolt. However, they were completely unaware of the seriousness of the matter. They viewed it as a local disturbance, a policing action. They sent only a small force to deal with the situation. These forces were quickly defeated by the organized and battle-hardened rebels. Rome's complacency had just met Eunice's prophecy. To make matters worse for Rome, another group of slaves in Sicily rebelled. This was an entirely separate uprising, this time led by an infamous brigand named Cleon. Cleon was a man of action, a known and feared figure. When the Romans learned of this, they were initially pleased. They believed the two factions would confront each other. They assumed the two rebel leaders would fight for dominance, and in doing so, destroy each other, saving Rome the trouble. This calculation was fatally wrong. Cleon did not see Eunice as a rival. He saw him as a king. In a move that stunned the Roman authorities, Cleon put himself on Eunice's side. He acknowledged Eunice's royal authority, adding another 5,000 men to his cause and acting as his general. This was the moment the revolt transformed from an uprising into a war. Eunice now had the spiritual authority, and Cleon provided the tactical brigand's mind. With this impressive combined force, the slave army marched on the city of Cragis. And they took it easily. Things seemed to be going incredibly well for Eunice's cause. His success was magnetic, so much so that even many free men belonging to the lower classes, men who were not slaves but were crushed by the same latifundia system, joined his cause. This was no longer just a servile war, it was a class war, further increasing their numbers. After the rebels had rampaged for a month, Rome sent the praetor Lucius Hippias. He was given command of 8,000 Sicilian militiamen to deal with the revolt. This again showed that Rome was not aware of the seriousness of the matter. Eunice and Cleon now had around 20,000 men under their command. They were not a rabble. They were an army, seasoned by their earlier victories and led by the prophet king and the brigand general. The result was a foregone conclusion. The militia of 8,000 men was crushed by the slaves. The Roman standards were trampled into the dust. Immediately, the revolt spread even further, engulfing all of Sicily. The Roman disaster was then multiplied by three. Three other Roman praetors, leading forces of similar size, were defeated one by one. The island was lost. Eunice and Cleon were the masters of Sicily. Time passed. The year 133 BC arrived, and the revolt was still raging. Rome, preoccupied with its own political turmoil, had allowed the situation to fester.
You are undermining the very foundation of Rome.
The number of slaves in the rebel army reached a staggering 60,000. The rebels controlled the majority of the cities on the island. King Antiochus ruled from Enna, his prophecy fulfilled beyond his wildest dreams. But the dream was about to end. Surveyor Rome, humiliated and facing a genuine threat to its grain supply, finally decided to act with overwhelming force. This time, they did not send a praetor with local militias. They sent a consular army, the full weight of the Republic, led by the consul Lucius Piso. Piso was not there to police, he was there to conquer. Under his command, Rome achieved its first significant successes of the war. The tide began to turn. In a pitched battle, Piso's legions killed 8,000 slaves. The rebels, accustomed to defeating militias, shattered against the hardened steel of the legions. Piso was merciless. He ordered that all those who had been taken prisoner were to be crucified. The roadsides began to fill with the agonizing symbols of Roman authority. The message was clear. The time for underestimation was over. The following year, 132 BC, another consul, Publius Rupilius, was also sent to the island. Piso had been firm, Rupilius was ruthless. His mission was not just to win, but to annihilate the rebellion, to salt the earth so nothing like it could ever grow again. Rupilius began a pitiless campaign to finally suffocate the rebellion. He first marched on the city of Taormina, a major rebel stronghold. He did not attempt a direct assault.
Are you afraid to face us? Come, break your camp and fight, cowards! We are ready for you!
He built walls, moats, and siege lines. He cut off all supplies. He simply waited. Siege ground on for weeks, then months. Rupilius forced the rebels inside to resort to the unimaginable. They were pushed past the limits of desperation to cannibalism. The bonds of fellowship that had united them dissolved in the face of absolute gnawing hunger. The rebellion was eating itself. Finally, a rebel slave named Serapion, seeing the hopelessness of the situation, betrayed the rebellion. He opened the gates to the Romans. The legions poured in, assaulting the city with violence. The famished rebels, who were no longer capable of fighting, surrendered quickly. They were skeletons, shadows of the warriors who had defeated praetors. Rupilius, far from being merciful, ordered that all the slaves be rounded up.
Quick.
They were systematically tortured, a final lesson from Rome. Then one by one, they were thrown from a cliff. Taormina was cleansed. Sakun, after this brutal victory, Rupilius marched towards the rebel fort of Enna, the very birthplace of the revolt. When and this was the heart of the kingdom. Inside Cleon, the brigand general was garrisoned. Once again, Rupilius laid siege to the city. The walls of Enna were strong, but Rupilius's methods were stronger. Siege lines were drawn tight. Huakirig, Cleon and his men looked out from the walls and knew what was happening. They realized that they would soon suffer the same fate as those in Taormina. Cleon, the infamous bandolero, would not allow himself to die of hunger behind a wall. He decided to make a final stand. He preferred to die in battle, on his feet as a warrior. Pursum, he gathered his best men and led a desperate charge out of the gates, smashing into the Roman siege lines. The fighting was ferocious but futile. Suru, the rebels' morale was completely shattered by the vision of their leader, the indomitable Cleon, finally falling in battle. Midwa, he was cut down, and with him, the fighting spirit of the rebellion died. With their general gone, the defenses collapsed. Once again, the rebels were betrayed from within. Someone opened the gates, and the Romans took the city. The slaughter was immense. When Eunice, who was not in the city, heard of the fall of Enna and the destiny of Cleon, he knew his kingdom was finished. Eki, the prophecy had been broken. He fled with a small entourage of his most loyal men into the mountains. Nushtarara, by this point, the rebels across Sicily knew they were defeated. Rupilius's ruthless tactics had served their purpose. They had broken the morale of the rebellion completely. Mechurm, the few who remained with Eunice, his last 1,000 followers, knew that Rupilius would not be far behind. However, they knew the consul would hunt them down. They knew the fate that awaited them, the torture, the cliff, the cross. In a final act of desperation and loyalty, the slaves decided to end their own lives rather than be captured by Rupilius. They chose a quick end over a slow, agonizing one at the hands of the Romans. When the consul Roman finally arrived at the mountain stronghold, he found a scene of grim silence. The last of the rebel army was gone. His soldiers searched the area and found Eunice, the prophet king, the man who had commanded 60,000 men.
I found him.
He was not on a throne. Chiro, he was hiding in a cave with a few of his intimate friends. The magician who had promised to capture a city was now a fugitive in a dark hole. The leader of the slaves was arrested. There was no trial, no execution. Rome denied him a martyr's death. Eunice was thrown into a prison cell in Morgantina. He did not face the executioner. He finally died of disease in prison, a broken man. The First Servile War was over. Until then, it had been the most massive slave revolt the Roman world had ever seen. It had shaken the Republic to its core, proving that the foundation of its wealth was also its greatest vulnerability. But it was only the first of 3 such wars, each one more ferocious than the last.